all of the posts you're seeing are being produced by 2% of the LinkedIn population. So comment, go one step forward, like comment, try producing your own LinkedIn post of like, if you have something in your portfolio that's interesting, like, hey, I wrote this Jupyter notebook, or I was in this networking event, like just market your, like, this is the purpose of LinkedIn. LinkedIn is made for that purpose, to show the world what your skills are so you may get hired. Like, it's not trying to be anything else.
Juan Andrés, welcome to my podcast. Thank you for being here. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Thank you, Ira. I really appreciate the opportunity. My name is Juan Andrés Espinosa Torres. I am a PhD alumni in economics from USC, and I'm currently an associate at an analysis group.
So, how did you end up doing a PhD at USC?
This all started when I first moved to the US. So I lived in DC for 2 years. I actually worked for the Inter American Development Bank. I was working there for an economist, and my original plan was never to do a PhD. I got like convinced in the journey because when I was there, we were just splitting our time between research and some policy relevant reports. And I don't know, like at that time, I was 23, I was in a new city, I was a couple of years younger. And my time there was really productive because I learned a lot about myself. And more importantly, during my time there in DC, I saw how important and how influential like researchers and people with PhDs can be. And for me, that was really striking and really convinced me into like, wow, this might be something I want to do in the future. And then I started looking into it. And my supervisor at the time was really supportive of it. Like, I mean, he had a PhD himself. So he gave me a lot of guidance into like what are the nuances and the nitty gritty of like what it involves to do a PhD. So in the end, I ended up taking the plunge and going for it.
Did you apply to a lot of schools? Like, do you remember that thought process of where do you apply and so on?
So because I was working at a research department, I had this unique opportunity to talk to the seminar speakers. As you probably know, Ida, like at universities, there is the seminar, and when the faculty of different universities come, like oftentimes PhD students, or at least that was my experience at USC as well, have the chance to like have one-on-one meetings. So during my time there, whenever a speaker came, I remember I took advantage of that opportunity as an RA to talk to them, ask them like, how was your PhD experience? It was great for me because I got the experience to talk to job market candidates, but also I talked to more senior people, and it was just great to talk and learn. So all in all, in every meeting, I got a little bit of information that helped me like customize my poker of universities. I ended up applying to 19, actually. I remember I applied to 19 universities. The acceptance rate is not as high as you might think. I ended up like waitlisted slash getting two acceptances and two waitlists. And well, from that process, I ended up choosing going to USC in the end. But I remember doing the GRE, like the TOEFL, talking to my friends like, oh my gosh, this test, I have to retake it again, and then and learning about it and writing my essays, going through the feedback. Thankfully, like people at the ADV were super supportive, so they looked into my materials, they gave me some feedback, they helped me like getting there, and I really am grateful for all their help.
The application volume and acceptance rate sounds about right, I think. Most people I've talked to have a similar experience. Like, I remember I was in Sweden, so I had to physically mail my transcript. So I had a packet like this thick that it cost like, $50 to mail to each university because it was so heavy.
Yeah, I did that too. And now that you mention it, yeah, crazy. But yeah, I did that too from Colombia.
Why did you choose a USC?
Well, when I went there, I do recall talking to some folks there. I remember I saw you talk to Andreas the other day. I talked to him during the busy day. I got this unique insight from him, and I saw that they had like a lot of faculty to work with, and I really, really enjoy that. At the time, I wanted to be an econometrician, and I saw like there are these big faculties there, like there's Moon, there's Pesseran, there's this big group of great professors there. And I mean, my original plan was to do that. I think I flirted with that field for a little bit as well during grad school, but I ended up doing macro in the end. And long story short, what I enjoyed the most about USC was that it offered me like this weird trifecta that is rarely present in a lot of PhD programs, which is like great weather, great city, and great like program. So I mean, in the end, given what I had and what I was offered, I figured that was like a place that made sense to me to go.
I think the great city and weather is something I always emphasize when I talk to people who are thinking about doing a PhD. It's like, think about the fact that you're going to be there for 6, maybe even 7 years. And if you're unhappy about the place, even if the research is great, right? I'm not sure if that compensates. It's a preference thing, obviously, but I chose LA for a similar reason, and I had a great time in LA, is all I'm going to say.
I mean, definitely, I agree with you. Like, it's an experience where doing a PhD is an inherently very difficult thing to do. So, if your statistical models or whatever you're looking for are not working for today, and you're pissed off, and you're like, "Oh my god, like, why is not everything working?" But then you step out of the office, and then it's sunny outside, and you can go have an ice cream. That makes one hell of a difference than being in the snow and being like, well, there's nothing else I can do, right? Uh,
Yeah. So you ended up doing macro. I want to hear more about that because for me, I remember when I was in grad school, I thought macro made like no sense at all. And now I actually work doing macroeconomic modeling. So I have a lot of appreciation for it and I actually quite love it. But I would like to know what it was that made you switch from econometrics, which I think would have been an excellent path, to macro.
I mean, me being from Colombia, I think my background is more macro. I worked for a central bank of my country for a little bit before I came. My experience at the Inter American Development Bank was also one where I worked with macroeconomists, and I did some things related to economics of climate change. I did some also international finance work that is very prominent in these institutions, also public finances. So I got exposed to this wider range of topics, and then you see like these big institutions who loan like a lot of money to like or provide funds for governments to implement development projects and what this and what not. Then you see like the big impact that it has, and then like you kind of see like I had this unique opportunity to see like the impact of macroeconomics from a first, like I was in the front lines of that. So for me that was really inspiring to be like, wow, this is a field that I would be very interested in participating into. Because I mean, some of the events at the IDB I recall had this meeting of central bank people, and then they had like the chief economists of all the central banks in Latin America gathering and talking about the relevant issues, and like, well, this is how we've been working, this is the strategy that we've been taking in terms of like raising the interest rate or lowering it. And it helps like coordinate efforts among the region to help substance and provide more credibility to the institutions, which I think is really really important. And I don't know, like just me being part of that, I was like, wow, I'm just living through this huge like event, and wow, like you just then see like how important it is. So it just inspired me into going into macro, and I had this natural curiosity towards it because of the path that I was exposed at.
And so it sounds like you came at it from like an applied policy kind of perspective where you already knew that understanding macroeconomics has implications where you can do useful things if you understand it. I think for me, my introduction to macro was like some of these infinite utility optimization problems.
This guy lives forever, like what?
Yeah. So what did you end up doing your thesis about?
I mean, uni was macro, and I wanted to do a little bit of metrics again because my at my time at the IDV, I did mainly econometrics, but more on the macro side. So I wanted to do that, but then as I got in during my program, I got exposed to the first year macro, which I really enjoyed, like these infinite models that are a little bit aggressive in the first go, but in the end, like for me, it was interesting. Seeing it's just another tool of seeing how things work. So, in my experience, what I saw with macro is that the process kind of works in a more correlation sense. Well, they've gotten better about causality recently, but what I've seen recent papers have been doing is that you derive some statistics facts from the data, usually correlations, and then you try to explain them with a model because unfortunately you don't have like a lab or things like oftentimes experimental econ people have this chance to create these ideal conditions to experiment on. So to back out like what are the channels and what this, what not, I mean that's what those models I found them useful for at least. So my thesis, I focused on two, like the intersection of industrial organization and macro. So basically, had a couple papers focusing on market power and what were their implications in the aggregate macroeconomic level. So I have two papers on that. One on innovation around the Great Recession and how like big firms shift or introduce more or less products during this time as a strategy to try and like keep sales going. And I had another paper on like what were the implications of the pandemic over like market power. So me and a co-author, we established conditions for causality on this, and then we estimated markups and try to had this counterfactual to compare, and then that gave us like an effect. So we did some industry analysis, and it was really cool.
Are there any findings you can highlight from that paper about COVID and market power?
Sure. So, like, one big interesting fact is that, of course, there is heterogeneity. So, there are some clear winners and some clear losers. Unsurprising findings were like, well, aviation did pretty bad, entertainment industry did terrible. But then you had people like services who did amazingly well. Education, surprisingly, was in the middle. I would have expected them to do pretty bad because a lot of people did not enroll for college during the pandemic because it was like, if I don't go to a classroom, why should I go? So we looked a little bit into that. Grocery stores or like retail, we're also surprised to find they didn't do as well as you would think. And it's basically, or the way we try to assess and the conclusion we arrived to is that it's because this is a low margin industry, even though everyone was at home and people could only grocery shop, so people were going to Trader Joe's more often as a therapeutic thing. In the end, probably their sales may have increased, but their markup pretty much remained the same. So it was interesting to see like they made more profits, but it's their markup kind of like stayed the same. So those were some implications that we gathered from this study.
And what were the findings of the first paper you mentioned?
Well, this one on the innovation one, surprisingly, I found that during the Great Recession, there's some price shifting behavior. So, I mean, the price shifting behavior is not new. This comes from an old paper, but I did find on the margin that firms introduce new products is not, but they do not remove them. So it's kind of like, because there's a lot of like product shifting. I use Nielsen Homescan data for that, which is a huge retail panel. And to assess my findings, I found that the entry rate of products actually increased throughout that time. And the exit rate for some categories it increased, for some stayed the same. But it's not like they do this cannibalization. It's not they do that. They just leave the products on the shelf for as long as they can throughout that period, and they try to introduce newer products to see if they can capture some customers shifting their consumption throughout that time. And well, at least that's how I rationalize that.
Right. And so do you have any insights about whether that strategy works for them?
Most of these firms were already kind of big. So maybe if I had data on entrance or on the smaller firms, because I did observe that in the Nielsen data, but in order for me to link that to company financials, I had to restrict myself to the largest firms. So I lost, unfortunately, that segment in my study. But it would have been interesting to see what firm shifting behavior would have happened in entrance, because there is some papers suggesting that, I mean, clearly during recessions, entrants will face higher entry barriers, and then a lot of them will just leave. But unfortunately, I was not able to pin down anything. That was a limitation of my study in terms of that. Yes.
But I mean, both of those studies sound like they would be super applicable in the industry where you actually ended up working, right? So, did you come to the conclusion that you did not want to continue in academia and went into the private sector?
These things are very important to me. I realized during grad school that I wanted to work in teams more. When you're in grad school, you restrict yourself to like 5+ years working at something, and you restrict your attention to that. And I thought I wanted that coming into grad school, but then I realized interacting in teams and working in teams is more fun and it's more dynamic, and I think you learn more. I also realized when I started getting co-authors, for example in the COVID paper, I could engage them, we would go back and forth with ideas, and I realized that was very important for me. First and second, something that I have gotten a lot in industry that I think academia is a little bit lackluster is the mentorship. My first weeks in my new job, I just got a lot of mentorship, a lot of training. It's like people are telling me like, hey, this is how we code things in R. This is how we code things in Python. Like, these are the practices we have for Excel. And when someone tells you what these are, like, you learn a bunch of things that you didn't knew they existed. Because I was like, oh, there's a library to do this. Didn't knew there was this R library that, I mean, the janitor package. I didn't know it existed. So that was an example, and yeah, those two things helped me be, or I enjoy big time from shifting into industry. Because yeah, academia can be a very lonely place, and it can be like a place where yeah, you talk about this thing that 10 people will understand really well, and then the rest of the world is like, well, okay, good for you, but
I have a friend who is a theoretical mathematician, and I forget what it is. It's some sort of extremely theoretical thing where, like at economics, even if it's a very specialized theory paper or econometrics paper, like pretty much any economist can still read it and get the idea. Now, what this friend of mine was doing in math was so abstract that there literally were like 5 people in the world who would even understand remotely what it is about. And that sounded very lonely.
right. I mean, it's definitely, as you mentioned, one of the perks of doing a PhD in econ. I think econ is unique in the sense that its industry market, I think it's very good. In the end, you have a PhD, and I think PhDs train you in this unique way that can help you transition into industry in an easier, not well, easier way in the sense that you have a lot of skills that you can use there. You just need to learn how to point them out and make recruiters aware you have them.
What are your main tips for econ PhDs, but maybe even broader PhDs, probably statistics PhDs or machine learning PhDs for a successful transition into industry?
It's a great point because I think it can be overwhelming for a lot of PhDs. You know, when you're in this environment, when you're working alone, and you think you're supposed to be everything by yourself, and you're not. You're only human. So things that I would tell PhDs to do is do always and always. This is a must do. Try and do an internship in the third and fourth year, depending on your time horizon. And because even if you don't get an internship from the get go, you can learn a lot about the process and how to apply. So that'll be my first thing. Second thing, and I think this is a trap that a lot of people fall into when until it's too late, and it's to assume the transition is like, oh yeah, like Amazon's waiting to with a job offer with a blank check at the end of this. Like that's I found it to not be necessarily true. I mean, like you have the skills, but you need to invest some considerable time into like marketing yourself and showing to industry hirers that you have those skills. And I think oftentimes a lot of people think like, yeah, if the academia thing won't work out, the industry's waiting for me. That's like a half truth. I mean, it is true, but you need with that nuance. I think it's important to consider and do that.
So that's a really good point. So how do you do that? How do you signal to the industry that you are a good candidate?
One thing that definitely helps going back to the internship, if you have internship experience, you show that you demonstrate first that you have been successfully hired by someone in the industry, then you have worked in this environment, and therefore like you know what a workflow is, you know a little bit of the jargon, you know you're gonna be in teams, like you're not this grad student stuck in an office forever. So I think that's important, but also everything about the resume, right? Like people talk a lot about the resume, and you see people resume this, resume that, but what is a good resume? I do think, especially with AI, I believe these ATA systems are getting more and more sophisticated, and it's becoming more difficult to get your resume across the board. So to subsumize or to circumvent that obstacle, I think I would recommend people to do one or all of the following things. First, hire like a coach or like a resume writer. It seems like a lot of grad students it's face like some financial constraints. I hear that, but if you can afford it, or because a lot of them have a price tag, and you see the price tag from the get-go, and you're like, oh my god, that's too expensive. Like, no, 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 I'll do it myself. Like, no, like this is an investment. You will realize after your third or second paycheck it won't matter. That's one thing that I want to bring up. Second, try to network as much as possible. I think networking is one of the pitfalls that PhDs oftentimes don't do very well. I mean, I work with MBAs. That's one of the things from my job. I work constantly with MBAs, and I just always astonished in awe seeing how good they are at networking. It's like just comes natural to them. It's like, oh wow. It's like, is there something you're doing that I'm not? And then, well, I've had the chance to ask them questions and be like, what is it that you do? And they're like, well, back in my MBA, like we learned this. And it's like, oh wow. Like, yeah, those are skills that you can learn, right? If I can recommend also a piece of reading, because I know grad students are great readers as well, there's this book by this guy called Isa Hankel. I don't know if you know him.
No, we'll link all the things you mentioned in the show notes.
He has this book called The Power of a PhD. I think it's a great book because, first of all, it tells you all of these things in detail. Second, it offers you like resume templates. It tells you why a resume is important, what should be in a resume. It gives you like some pointers, some bullets that you could use. And he also even offers covers letters and like templates, and tells you like this is what you should put in a cover letter, this is what an employer is looking after in a cover letter, and this is what you should use this space for. And I just think the book is very well written. It's short, it's very short, so you can read it in 1 week if you commit to it. But the way I would encourage people to read it, which is a little bit what I did, that's the book I used. I literally opened the chapter on resume, and as I was reading the book, I had my resume open and I started doing things simultaneously. So by the end, after I was done with the chapter, I was like, well, I have a first draft of my resume. And I always point people out to that book because I think it's a great book.
Would you say a lot is about signaling to the employer not only what your skills are, why they should care from a business context?
Yes, I think that's oftentimes something that not only PhDs, but in general job candidates miss. I also have seen this at the undergrad level. It's like saying, hey, I took this class at this, or for PhDs, it's like, yeah, I processed this amount of data, or I published this paper. So what? I mean, like, great, good for you, but what the employer wants to know is like, oh, what is the impact of this paper? Well, if you want to, let me give a macro example. Like, I optimize government finances by 20%, like, because of the findings of my paper. If governments implement this, they will be cutting their deficit by 20%. I mean, that's a huge number.
That would be great.
But putting it in more smaller context, you could always say, like, for example, in my dissertation, this Nielsen data set is huge, like it's 6 terabytes. It's big data, effectively. So for me, one of the bullets I wrote was like, I process more than 6 terabytes of data in order to achieve this goal, which was to compute exit and entry rates. By doing that, I can potentially influence the advertisement or the decision for companies in light of what I'm seeing. Or you could always say, like, by processing this, I ended up cutting processing times by this amount. Say if you have written a certain code that makes things efficiently, therefore standardizing the workflow or making things shorter and more readable for my client, whoever my client is.
I think that's a great way to think about it. And maybe one question to ask yourself when you write the resume is, would a completely non technical person understand my value if they read this resume? Right? Because if you write something like, I wrote a paper that proves the central limit theorem of estimating endogenous connections in social networks, that means nothing to a non technical person. But if you write it the right way, like your grandma should understand sort of what the value is that you bring.
Right. And I think you point out to a very important thing, which is oftentimes and more often than not, the hiring manager doesn't even have a PhD or doesn't even know what the position is about. Like, I mean, they have an outline of the shopping list of the things that the company wants, but they don't necessarily know what a central limit theorem is, or they don't even know what a markup is, or a technical term like that. Like, so it's important that your resume always reaches out all of the audiences, as much audiences as possible. Like, assume someone who reads this has no idea what a supply curve is, right? Because yeah, it's fair to not know. I mean, I didn't know until I went to my undergrad in economics. So just assume like people don't know like the meaning of these terms, even though they may sound like obvious to you. Because yeah, if you are a PhD trained person, yeah, you've been working with this for too long, and yeah, it sounds obvious to you, but it's not. More often times, it's not. So
Well, and I think to some degree it's like intellectual laziness to just use technical jargon because you're not even making the effort of really explaining it.
oftentimes it's just like something that when you make things accessible for others, first of all, you have a higher impact because more people will read you or know about you. And second, you come off as a more empathetic human being. Like, nobody likes to feel dumb. I mean, I certainly don't like feeling dumb. When I read something I don't understand, I feel a little bit angry about the person who wrote it because it's like, hey, I don't have the understanding that you have clearly, and you're making me more conscious and aware of it. So the papers I appreciated the most in grad school were the ones written in a way that anyone could read them. But when you do it, like, it's very appreciated because you reach all the audiences.
Not only that, I think you learn something by doing it that way. I want to go back to the networking because this is a recurrent theme. And I think it applies kind of across the board, right? You don't need to be a PhD student to think that right. It's important for everyone. I think students of all levels. And do you have any tips for the students who are in an environment where it maybe does not come as naturally as for some of the MBA students you mentioned?
Right. So one of the things I learned from MBAs is like the famous coffee chat thing. I mean, it sounds like such a nuanced thing, but it actually works. It's important to build rapport. There are often networking events. Like, something I recommend people is to go to alumni events from your university if you did an undergrad, because you already have a network of people who you have something in common. Is that you went to the same school or the same program, and you never know. Maybe the people that you interact there have an opening, or are the CEO because these alumni events have people of all levels of expertise. So you could run into the CEO of a Fortune 500 company, you never know. Or you could run into like a director of the CFO, or the director of finance of a company, or something like that. Or a data scientist that will be hiring data analysts. I don't know. So that's one thing. Another thing is LinkedIn. Again, this is one of the chapters of this book I talk about. There's an entire chapter about like why LinkedIn, LinkedIn this, LinkedIn that. It's really important. Like, use your prompts, talk to the people. And when you go to networking events or these social settings, I have more, maybe it's because I'm Latin American, I don't know, but Latin Americans just like to engage with people in general. So I have found that some of my friends and also myself, I have networked without wanting to network. So it's like I go to a social setting and I start chatting with people. I get interested in them because it's like, oh wow, you have done this. That's super cool. Oh, you surf every day. Oh wow, how do you manage to do that? And turns out when you make organic connections, people will help you, and of course you will help people. Like we're just human beings. Like, approach this from that perspective. Like, you're a human talking to another human. And like oftentimes I have found this to just, yeah, like then jobs start showing up because then people tell me like, I saw this job and thought of you because, yeah, I remember you're an economist, even if they have nothing to do. And you can check it and judge for yourself if it's a good fit or not. But it's just like, it's really really important. And yeah, use LinkedIn, use the alumni events from your university. And for the most part, this probably is more tailored to PhDs. Try to talk to senior students or alumni from your program, or if you know alumni from other programs, because it turns out they might have learned a trick or two since they graduated, and then they can actually share that knowledge with you, and they would be more than gladly to help you. I mean, I would.
Yeah, I have also spoken with several people, and I think it's very natural once you get your first job and then you start working, and like you remember when you were a student and that all seemed very distant. I think then you're really excited to share everything you might have picked up along the way with someone else.
Because yeah, in the end, I think people care. In the end, it's like people are trying to protect you. That's what I have found. Like, seeing all the advice I got from alumni, a lot of them would tell me these things, and I would be like, "Why are you telling me this?" And sometimes I will find out the hard way, like, "Oh, that's why." And it's like people just want to avoid you any pain or suffering that they may have gone through, because it's like, yeah, this is not my first rodeo. I went through this difficult situation, what this, what not. I'm just trying to share this knowledge so you don't have to. And by avoiding that, you probably will be in a better position, and maybe you'll run into another difficult situation. So you're building more knowledge that you can share for more and more people.
So for LinkedIn, what's your strategy for networking on LinkedIn?
I think it's very important to do three things. First of all, your profile must be in great condition, namely like customize your name tags correctly, like your education, list the skills correctly, list experiences, use bullets. Try to make this as clean as the resume as possible. First of all, your profile. Second of all, engage. There's this LinkedIn. I don't like calling her an influencer because she does way more than that. Her name is Ashley Ruba. I don't know if you've seen any of her posts. She's a woman who transitioned from academia to industry, and she comes from the social sciences. And one of the things she talks about is like engage, because like the number of people who do not engage in LinkedIn is like 98%. Like, all of the posts you're seeing are being produced by 2% of the LinkedIn population. So comment, go one step forward, like comments, try producing your own LinkedIn post of like, if you have something in your portfolio that's interesting, like, hey, I wrote this Jupyter notebook, or I was in this networking event. Like, just market your, like, this is the purpose of LinkedIn. LinkedIn is made for that purpose, to show the world what your skills are so you may get hired. Like, it's not trying to be anything else. So do that. And if you have any expertise in some of these, this is a new feature that I like from LinkedIn, like the articles. You have some experience, share it, because that gets your name out there, and that helps you beat ATS software. It helps you also connect, because sometimes I've received connection requests from people saying like, "Hey, I saw what you wrote in that collaborative article. I thought it super interesting. I also looked you up, and I really like your profile. Can we connect or chat?" Sometimes the opportunities will come to you if you'll open the door for that. Like, people are just getting their name out, and if you're in the job search, use the open for work button. Because, for example, some friends I've talked to recently, they'll tell me, no, I don't want to put the green thing because I'll look desperate. And I immediately told them, like, no, you're not doing this right, because when you do the green thing, actually, I think that shows you up in the when hiring managers look people up. Like, if you have the green banner, that I think that bumps you up. So it's important to do so.
Would make sense, right? And I don't know, right? But when you're hiring, every hour or minute you invest in trying to source someone is a risky investment, right? And then if someone actually tells you that they're looking for work, that decreases the riskiness of that time you're spending on them. So it would make sense to me. That is a good idea.
Indeed, yeah. And the thing is that I have not been like actively part of a recruitment committee, but I have been indirectly linked in some recruiting tasks. And yeah, the employer is scrutinizing everything. It's like we don't have much time to go through a lot of profiles, and we need to find the best candidates possible with this constraint of time. So like every bit counts in terms of what you can show. So this is also why networking is invaluable, because you're giving a chance to talk to a human being. And yeah, we're rational what this will not, but we react to feelings. So if you make a genuine connection with someone, you're probably more prone to pay attention to what they have to say in the future versus some like random like what black and white piece of paper that arrives to you, and you look at it and you're like, oh well, you seem impressive, I don't know, right?
That's definitely true. And I think the key word you used there is genuine. So I recently had this conversation with another podcast guest where he was emphasizing that networking is about making a genuine connection, exactly like you said, and showing real interest, right? It's not like checking a box, so I have this person on my contact list.
Yeah, and another thing that's important, like if it's not genuine, don't ask for a referral. That's always a little bit, I mean, like tough. Like asking for those referrals can actually hurt you in the end, because it's like, yeah, like if I feel like I'm being used instead of like we are investing together into building a relationship, I think that's something nuanced that I do believe sometimes PhD students fall on. But it's one of the things that's important too.
I think it's a delicate thing of how do you do this properly, right? Because the truth is that, of course, the ideal situation is you have a really good friend and they work at a company and a role opens up that's perfect for you and they are just so happy to refer you, right? Because you know each other and you're perfect for this role. But there are situations where someone from your school that you don't really know works at a company and there's a role that you think you're a really good fit for. And I think at that point, the right way to do it is to reach out and be like, hey, this is me. Attach your resume and like short sentence or two about why you're interested in the role and why you think you're a good fit. And then I would say I would be happy to jump on a call to virtually meet, and so you can see if you'd like to refer me. Right? Because the truth is people do get incentives from referring good candidates, and it is a win-win kind of situation. And I think the mistake I sometimes see students do is they will reach out, but they will be somehow very entitled about the position. They kind of assume I'm going to refer them. They don't send their resume, so I have to use my time to write back and ask them for it and so on. So I think there is a way to do it, even if you don't know someone, that is elegant and doesn't sound too entitled.
Exactly, and I think it's a delicate thing. And again, it's because PhDs unfortunately do not get much training in terms of this. That ends up hurting you in the end. I mean, nobody told me how to do this. I had to learn it, and take a couple bumps in the road, and yeah.
And I think the statistics that we cannot emphasize enough is what you said about 98% of people just consuming content instead of creating. And I think by creating content, you learn a lot just by sitting down and writing something. You're forced to think about it in a different way. And you get feedback from people who you would have never talked to otherwise. And I think creating content is something you can start doing early as a student, right? Nothing says that you have to wait until you're on the job market. And so that could be a way of building social skills along the way.
Well, so I am currently an associate. Basically, going back to my dissertation topic, I think it was a good fit for me because we do a lot of antitrust related things. We support clients in different things. We calculate, for example, consumer harm, we do damages, we calculate also, or oftentimes try to see whether there's market power in a certain industry, or we also do some strategy things. So like a company hires us to like determine something like, hey, how is this gonna look like if I launch this new product? Like, will it face competition? What this, what not? And yeah, so I basically work in teams most of the time. And I really appreciate it because I work with like senior and junior people. So we have plenty of analysts. There's plenty of people of my rank who's associate. There is managers, vice presidents, and it's kind of like you work on project slash case basis, and everyone in the team has like a role. So it's kind of like in the end is like if this doesn't go well, we're all looking bad. It's not like it's just the manager who's gonna look. No, everyone is gonna look bad. So, and if it goes well, then everyone looks great because everyone has like a different task to do, and I think it's a great thing.
Was there anything that was surprising about the transition into a quote unquote real job?
Well, for me, it's going back to the pace. I do think the consulting world has a faster pace than grad school. It's something I appreciate because I like learning. I realized through grad school I needed to do a PhD to realize I don't want to know a lot about one thing. I want to know a little bit about everything. So, and this job offers me that. So, like, I'm working one project and then another project is like completely unrelated. So, you're in the constant learning, and I really appreciate that. And also, one thing that usually doesn't is as advertised or as told is how knowing a different language can actually help you. So, in my job, oftentimes we run into like a client or a situation where like the client is a Spanish speaking like company or is in Latin America or is in Spain or their documents in Spanish that we need to review. And he's like, oh my God. Turns out like yeah, so if I mean in my case, like that has helped me like get stuff or work because it gives you an edge.
That definitely makes sense. And I think it's something that's not often talked about. So maybe this is a great segue to our second part of the podcast, which will be in Spanish.
Absolutely, yeah, I think so.
Me parece un tema muy interesante que si utilices español en tu trabajo